everyone. I'm Sydney. I'm just going to introduce Gina quickly. So Gina Osterloh is an artist working in photography, performance, and movement, video, and sculpture. Through her multidisciplinary practice, she investigates questions essential to a photographic practice. Questions around representation and identity, the transformation from 3 to 2-dimensional space, presence and absence, the illusion and the real. Her work invokes the origins of mark-making. In her performance, Press and Outline, performed at the Broad Museum in LA, she traces her silhouette projected onto a wall. In her sculpture, she welds the surface of metal, quite literally writing with light. In her hand-drawn grids and constructions for the camera, Gina invokes different notions of time within a photograph. John Berger writes that drawings reveal the process of their own making, their own looking, more clearly than photographs. There's an internal logic to drawing where the hand reacts to its own mark-making and responds to what was put to paper moments before. Gina's drawings and photographs operate in this way. They contain an internal logic that continues to build on itself. In Gina's work, the artist's hand is revealed while her body, her face, her identity in many ways is obscured or held at a distance. Where does a body begin and end? How do we understand a portrait? What is the nature of a specific absence and what can be recognized within that supposed vacancy? Gina's work has been exhibited at Higher Pictures Gallery, the Broad Museum, Silver Lens Galleries, the International Center of Photography, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, and others. Her work has been reviewed in publications such as The New Yorker, Art in America, The Brooklyn Rail, Asian Art News, and Art Forum. Her accolades include receiving an Ohio Arts Council grant for individual excellence, the Wayne P. Lawson Columbus Museum of Art Acquisitions Award, a Fulbright in the Philippines, a Woodstock Center of Photography residency, and a Create Cultivate grant with the LA County Arts Commission and LACE. Gina is currently an assistant professor at Ohio State University and has an upcoming solo exhibition at the Columbus Museum of Art. And lastly, I just wanted to say that I was first introduced to Gina's work at her Higher Pictures show in 2020. I felt an immediate affinity for her work and was drawn to the way that she used sculpture and performance in her work. Gina cites her experiences as a mixed-race Filipina-German American woman in Ohio as being formative in leading her to photography and larger questions of perception. As a mixed-race Japanese European American woman, I feel deeply connected to the way that she works across mediums to think through ideas around liminal space, the discovery of identity, and perceptions of difference. Please join me in welcoming Gina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I first wanted to acknowledge where we are in this context of a university, graduate and undergraduate studies, and really start with the type of, first mentioning that all of us in this room have multiple origin stories. But the one I'm going to tell is through photography, and specifically this photograph that I made in graduate school, which was my very first photo tableau. And I'm going to take a little bit more time with this image, and then I'll speak more quickly through the subsequent works. A reference point, in many ways, a profound origin point, my first photo tableau construction for the camera, in which I attempted to present and activate representations of a body in a portrait, a body caught in a false or erroneous set of questions, starting with, hey, what are you? And so this question of, hey, what are you, really just an early question that was yelled at me growing up in the Midwest. Right? So this process of hailing, interpellation, right? Louis Althusser's notion of being called, and the body automatically responds in a set of constructs that we are all born into, right? A paradigm of constructs that we are all born into. And I wanted to cut a hole in that process. When I first moved to LA, I grew up in Ohio, and I somehow escaped to San Francisco and Los Angeles for 22 years. When I moved to LA, it sounds so cliche, but I was incredibly infatuated with the sunset and palm trees. And that vast, never-ending horizon, this ephemeral sunset that was polluted and almost fake in a way. Right? I was also conflating that landscape with stories that my mother had told me growing up in the Philippines that were really a conflation of idyllic stories with family, but also acute trauma. She was 4 years old when Japanese soldiers burned down her family's home in World War II. And so I found a professor at UC Irvine. I went to UC Irvine for grad school, which was, wow, grad school. An incredibly life-changing time in my life. Very unexpected. I had this print on my studio wall, the print. Walking by the print, walking by the print. And I became incredibly attracted to, repulsed by, infatuated with the shape of the hair, the head. A very simple gesture of turning away. What would it look like to turn away from the camera? So many photographers use this visual strategy, turning away. But what would it look like? It was both human and animal. It was this type of hole or void in the middle of the picture plane. It was vaginal. Kobina Mercer compiled a book called Discrepant Abstraction. And in it, author Angeline Morrison, in her chapter, Autobiography of an X-Colored Surface, Monochrome and Liminality, she writes, "So if there is nothing to see, what can you find to say? Once a blank space is foregrounded, framed, and actively presented as a separate entity in its own right, then historically received notions of meaning are radically destabilized. When a spectator stands before a pictorial surface, they expect some type of picture. When confronted by a picture that does not depict, a sort of psychic panic often ensues." At the time, in hindsight, my interest in camouflage, passing or not, simultaneously passing and not passing for a particular identity or racial group, I see now that my metaphors were quite clunky, right? Literally putting on camouflage pants. This was made in a professor's office that wasn't being used, and I think it was really instructive and important in terms of my process. I didn't know what I was doing in terms of knowing verbally or being able to articulate what I was doing. But the picture became more and more flat. This was right after I came back from the Philippines for the first time, and I found just a scene of the quote-unquote tropics on eBay, and I was considering the gesture of being on one's knees and hands up. So this conflation of giving up one's individuality to a greater force field, the police hold up, being hailed. This was a big jump for me. It was the first move I made away from, I guess you would say, and we can talk about this later or argue with it, literal representation. And I was incredibly infatuated with, and I still am, monochrome painting. I wanted to get to the underlying visual strategy of camouflage and not the literal visual strategy. So mimesis, the copy. From the beginning of my practice, I am incredibly infatuated with what photography does, flattening this world of physical 3D volume into something flat. And I wanted to play with that. For this image, I collaborated with a fellow grad student, raised the floor in concrete, wood blocks, kind of shimmied my way across the wood blocks, and he cut around my legs and my wrists so I kind of sank down into the ground. And again, the head, the shape of the head, the hair, where it is, in line with the lens. I think probably before I made this work, I was asking, what would it look like if there was a symbiotic relationship between the body and the environment? What would it look like if there was some type of confusion between the body producing space and space producing the body, eating and vomiting? I was asking, what would it look like if the room wasn't square? Thinking about how space interpolates the body. What would it look like if the body itself was mimicking the void? And in this photograph, again, grad school, I became acutely aware of depth of field in terms of a viewer viewing the photograph. So a viewer encountering a physical print on the wall, 40 feet away, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, 2 inches. What is revealed? So from afar, a viewer might see some type of stain or splotch on the wall, and upon closer inspection, the color of my skin, the delineation of hair. So all of the slides in this slide PowerPoint are all 4x5 that are scanned, except for one image, that is, from the digital camera. The visual strategy of I guess I would say the visual strategy, the form of the orifice is a type of through line throughout all of my work. And for this work, I was simply asking, what would it look like if I stood on the other side? What's on the other side? At the time, I was considering the room structures as a type of second skin, an extension of the body. And so for this work, I simply stood behind a 9-foot wide photo backdrop piece of paper, pressed against the back of it, and just cut out a hole where my mouth would be. So again, that experience of the viewer seeing this photograph from afar and just seeing a hole or a dot floating in this color field, but it's upon closer inspection seeing tongue, teeth, and lips. This is one of the works I made when I was in the Philippines on a Fulbright, and I thought after graduate school, moving to the Philippines for 9 months, that my work would shift drastically, but it only became more focused. And I found this paper in all these paper shops across Manila in this blue, pastel, yellow, green, pink, and wanted to I think, let me step back. My experience living in the Philippines was more grounded in the misrecognition of not just a physical body, but in language. And wanting to speaking Tagalog, but the words not coming out right? So trying to speak stripes, but the words came out as dots. It was also my first move away from the human figure, so moving from an actual body to paper mache. So the tracing of the figure, in this work, I was tracing not the shadow, but the just outline of friends. Thinking about this space of portraiture, how do we recognize a figure in space? Realizing that it sounds quite cliche, but it's really dependent upon the recognition of head and shoulders, right? Head, neck to shoulders, to recognize a figure. Moving towards flatness, and the first time thinking about the shape of a group in relationship to an individual. And really uncanny things started to happen in this very pared down space. And just simple things like the line of the floor lining up with the edge of the figure. Really wanting to play with camouflage in terms of this visual splintering or flickering. And it was the first time in my work that I started to work with an applied pattern, such as the dots. There's a book called The Edges of Surrealism by an author named Roger Caillois, Caillois. And in it, Caillois talks about camouflage being not a defense mechanism, let's say, of animals, certain animal species or insects, but rather the inability to maintain one's individuality. Right, so the inability for a body to maintain its psychic energy, as Caillois stated. And I really thought that was, for me, a very helpful entry point to camouflage. Right? So not as a defense mechanism, but rather this presence, this way of being in which it's almost a sharing of space. The body is inhabiting space, and a move to see or understand from multiple viewpoints. Right? So it was helpful for me to understand camouflage as not a tactic of war, right? But a way in which a body can occupy an out-of-body space. I wanted to move past the figure, and so I quite literally started to hang out in photographic space itself. I started to just press against and slowly trace photo backdrop paper, vertical and horizontal planes. The expectation to see a figure, to be able to identify a figure. Thinking about the invention of the camera, thinking about the time period in which the camera was invented and its technologies were disseminated, right? So thinking about how every technology is born in a certain social, cultural moment, right? Thinking about early colonial photography, even though it's not visually present in my work perhaps, but thinking about the capturing and identifying the classification of human beings, right, through the structure of the grid. Thinking about photography as a progression of single-point perspectival systems, right, that organize space in a particular way, order space. No body to name, nothing to look at, no arrival point. I have, in 2014, I made one 16 millimeter film work, and I've never worked with 16 millimeter films since. I'd like to. I was literally staring at another print, the press and erase red photograph where I was pressing into the black hole. And I was also reading a book by an author named Victor I. Stoichita, and it's called I might get it wrong, A Brief History of the Shadow. And so I'm going to play some of the film. It's silent, and I'll speak over it. So in the book by Victor I. Stoichita, he's recounting Pliny the Elder. Some people say Pliny, some people say Pliny. I'm saying Pliny. And in it he's Pliny is gathering, this is 1st century AD, gathering oral account stories across the regions of Greece and Egypt, and a recurring story is a story of a young woman. Her father is a potter, and you probably read the story, but I'll share it anyways. And the young woman's lover is about to leave to go abroad. It may be assumed that he is about to go abroad for battle, to never to return. And so she casts his silhouette, his profile against the wall, and traces it on the wall. The young woman's father sees the tracing and fills it in with clay, a relief of the young man's profile. And I was so struck by how this story, this written account, the depictions of silhouettes and tracings of figures clearly and had existed for centuries and centuries before. But this is one of the first written account of the act of representation, the act of tracing and making one's image permanent. And I was so enthralled by how this is an origin story of drawing and painting and sculpture, but also photography. And Pliny's not describing the camera as a mechanical device as we know it, but this act of making one's image permanent, but grounded in this experience of an absolute obliteration of love, right? Absolute loss. The title of the film is Press and Outline. As we know, 16 millimeter film comes in these in lengths of about almost 3 minutes, but by the time you load the film and take out the film, you lose a bit of the beginning and the end. So for one reel of film, I pressed into my shadow, and for another reel of film, I outlined my shadow. And I just spliced them together, and that became the film. I've made copies of the film and I've shown it as film projections. I try not to show it as video in spaces, but I've been asked to show it as video and I'm gradually acquiescing into the video. But for me, the real work is the 16 millimeter loop, the film. There's a visual flickering, there's a certain magic. There's, the best way I've shown this work was at the ICP museum. I asked them to project it only about 2 feet by 2.5 feet. There's something about the clicking and the mechanical sound of the projector. Once I had a visit with the curator, he was so insistent, like, how did you digitally manipulate the shadow? Hey guys, what are you talking about? I didn't touch, this is just film, you know. He's looking at the 16mm film. So I was interested in that type of play between real and illusion, the physical and the psychological, right? The tangible and the projected. So quite a jump. I'm jumping forward about 3 years. When I moved back to Ohio, I grew up in Ohio, I lived in San Francisco, California, and then I got a job offer. I applied. I was asked to apply, and I applied, and I got the job at Ohio State. I didn't have a studio. I was like, wow, I have time to actually, because I wasn't adjunct commuting to various parts of Southern California, I have time to look through all of my old sketchbooks. And I draw, I sketch, I try to just write or doodle something before I go to sleep every night. And I began to see this recurring theme, this catalog of all the visual schemata that I've been using for 15 years. The room, hair, the orifice. And so I said, okay, I have an apartment wall. I'll put up photo backdrop paper and just enlarge the drawings, and then photograph those drawings. But these are 34 by 35.5 inches wide. And of course, certain questions, common questions are, why not just the drawing? Why the photograph? Why does it have to be photography? And maybe it's really just a meditation with photography, not about photography, but with photography. There's no delineation between the mark and the paper. It's absolute flatness. It was also really about process and meditation. Again, a cataloging of all the visual schema I've been using for 15 years with photo tableaux. I think also an infatuation with just light and photo paper. That 1 degree of really just losing the texture of the drawing paper, the photo backdrop paper, and translating that to photo paper. After this work, however, I realized that I wanted to push back into volume in terms of how, and I know this might not be talked a lot about in grad school, I don't know, I'd love to talk more about it, but the emotive register, how my work was registering. The zones work, the drawings on photo backdrop paper, I thought were getting a little bit just too intellectual, flat. So representation, reproduction, presence, absence, erasure, wrapping all of those functions, strategies into this body, the anonymous replica. I think I was also loosely thinking about fables and narratives of woman as monstrous in this work. But again, really wanting to return to those early visual strategies, the void or the hole in the middle of the picture plane, and wanting the body to be the void, the entire body to be the void. Just simply playing with 3D and flatness, printing out my mummified taped form onto a photograph, gluing it to matte board or cardboard. Yes, you can see the eyes. This is the first portrait, traditional portrait I ever made in, what was that, 2019. And as artists, I'm sure you might find that when making bodies of work often are not discrete. They circulate and bleed into each other. So some of these works are about to reappear in a show I finished end of this 2021. At a gallery in the Manila, Philippines called Silver Lens Galleries. They started as just a photo gallery and they've expanded into all art. But the title of the show is Her Demilitarized Zone. So I'm going to read some words from Her Demilitarized Zone. I estimate about 15 more minutes, so stay with me. The formation of Her Demilitarized Zone crystallized with a photograph created at the beginning of the COVID-19 closures. Mirror Woman in 2020. Addresses this physical and psychological sites of skin, torso, the face, and eyes. Created in spring of 2020, with each gesture of cutting reflective tape pressing against my skin, I covered my torso and face, including orifices of the auditory, speech, and sight, to conjure contradictions embedded in borders, boundaries between self and other, and potentially national borders. Congruous with the arc of photographs leading up to this work, Mirror Woman refutes portraiture's innate ability to present a legible subject, resisting preconceived notions of identity, such as race and gender, that one may project onto a body. In my photographs, I have developed simple and more complex ways to interrupt this seemingly natural process of identification, turning my head away from the camera, camouflage, or wrapping my body in tape. These methods that deny readability are strategies of refusal, protection, and care. As tape becomes a surrogate for skin, Mirror Woman deflects assumptions based on vision. Eyes sealed shut, the seeming inability to breathe through the nose, mouth taped, her featureless shape also evokes woman as monstrous. Mirror Woman activates how a viewer may determine who belongs and who is considered alien. In shutter vision, my jaw holds the shutter release for the camera. Closing my jaw, teeth biting down, an image is formed, eyes closed. How do we see each other? Is it possible to embrace each other physically, virtually, spiritually, like a photograph, even for a fleeting moment in time and space? How do we cut through ideological divisions? At times, my photographs and sculptural works adopt materials and forms that may reference fetish, BDSM practices, tape which wraps the body, a mouth gag. However, the image is fetish. Root definitions of the word fetish could indeed be describing the image. For example, an object, the possession of which is believed to procure the services of a spirit lodged within it, which also share origins with the word magic and the Portuguese word petitio, and the Latin root words for artificial and to make, facere. I simplify, amplify, lay bare the photographic field, a terrain of power, our global cultural and political landscape, dominance and submission, the two inextricably intertwined through looking, the photograph. And for the show, I worked with a designer, his name is Josh Shattuck, and made a poster for the show. And this is the outline for the poem, Her Demilitarized Zone, which I'll share in a little bit. I had a phenomenal artist, her name is Gloria Shows, help me make the silk screens with silver ink on black paper. I didn't check the sound. I'm going to try to share the poem this way. Her. Demilitarized. Zone. Pleasure. After centuries of war, they saw each other without weapon. He wept. And the sound, as seen in the slides, is by artist Gabby Strong, who is a photography-based artist and sound artist based in Los Angeles, who also went to UC Irvine. So her, demilitarized zone, open space, pleasure, after centuries of war, they saw each other without weapon. He wept. Her demilitarized zone is the steel plate with welded text, related to the steel poem that stretches across the gallery floor. The rectangular plate is a condensed marker, solid and heavy. It is also the dimension of a traditional darkroom photograph, 11 by 14 inches. Both the steel plate and the 17 steel bar sculpture with welded text began with the etymology of the word photography, to write, draw, and record with light. Akin to darkroom photography processes, each work also went through a series of water and chemical baths called black oxide to create a uniform dark tonal range, akin to both minimalist sculpture and mechanical machine part. A slow, steadfast process with heavy focus. Each work is singular and unique. Her demilitarized zone does not heal, instead lays bare our current cultural moment on a global scale. Scarred, wounded, seeking touch, in need of acute love, at once legible and illegible, words wrap, keloid, and mutate symbols of power. The photograph, pressing against looking, depicts long poles pressing into my eyes, activating the physical and conceptual pressure and pleasure of both looking and being looked at, the frenzy of vision. Sorry, we're losing a little bit of imagine. There's a seam here and a seam here, vertical walls and the floor. Psychic drop refers to the act of camouflage as a momentary loss of one's individuality, a psychic drop in ego. A starting point early in my photographic oeuvre, this line of inquiry persists throughout my work and originates from both personal experiences, growing up mixed race Filipino-German American, simultaneously experiencing passing and not passing for a singular or particular racial identity, and reading philosophy and art theory texts that consider camouflage as not a tactic of war, but instead a strategy to inhabit and understand other points of view, to embody space, perceptual viewpoints beyond one's inherited skin color or skin consciousness, or rather, to see with skin consciousness. I don't know if it's possible to see beyond one's skin consciousness, but in a recent conversation with curator and writer Yael Buencamino, Yael is the curator for the Philippine Pavilion of the Venice Biennial this year, Yael remarked, "Photography creates the potential for a momentary psychic drop, a loss of ego. Psychic drop, like a photograph, may be a fleeting shift in consciousness, yet key to de-weaponizing ways of seeing. In our fractured world pushed to rigid fixed extremes, may her demilitarized zone infinitely grow, dismantle symbols and language of war. May we see the day that HDZ, her demilitarized zone, dissipates, is no longer needed. May we unleash a duration of love." Thank you.
Thank you for such a great talk. Really great to see all the work. If there are questions, I'll begin. So I'm so curious to hear more about the motif of the cube, the interior space, or the illusion of interior space. I've heard it over and over again.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about what that means to you.
Yeah.
Why it's significant.
That's a really multi-layered, powerful question. Yeah. The cube, let's see, I'll start with, there was this moment in grad school where I became so frustrated with photo critiques because I couldn't, for lack of a better word, control. If I had an edge of a house, then it went to, oh, you're talking about domesticity. I guess I was really getting frustrated with the language of representation. And having certain parts of the picture plane already be familiar to a viewer, and so automatically preconceived notions of what something is will be projected onto the work. I wanted to pare things down, strip everything away. Start at nothingness if I could, but it's not nothingness. It's like +1, maybe. I am incredibly infatuated with color field painting. I totally had the cliche Rothko moment, like just meandering through Spain after I graduated from undergrad, and like in some museum and there's a Rothko, and I just like have this like out-of-body experience. You're just like, that sounds so cliche, but you're just like, what is it about color? There's something about color that holds the body it demands to be looked at. It holds vision, it activates vision and all of its adjacent qualities in the body. Later, it wasn't until later after grad school, I was like, oh, it's the camera. it's the empty box.
And then I guess an interrelated question would be your thoughts on abstraction in terms of how it relates to photography as opposed to other mediums.
Yeah.
That kind of push and pull between abstraction and representation.
Yeah. Right. Wow, Gregory, many entry points there. I think I first came to abstraction as wanting to rip a hole in representation. But then representation is thinking about how representation functions, right? It's both the image and it's the actual event. Right? It's the image and the actual person. And the actual person and event can't be extracted from the image, right? It's like this continuous loop, or it's the Venn diagram where the two circles overlap. And representation is also a very unwieldy ground. It's this field of shared conceptual maps, right? And these conceptual maps are both inherent to how the brain is wired, to learned cultural maps. Right, and it's such a onslaught. It's this onslaught of interpolation. Like we're constantly being interpolated by these shared conceptual maps, and it's really about the production of belief systems and ideologies, and it happens so rapidly. Right, we can't even quantify how we're participating, producing with and through representation. And for me, abstraction was a way to not permanently, but for a moment, put a hole in it, refuse it. It was a space where I'm interested also in abstraction outside of Western art history, right? And how abstraction is really a robust visual strategy that artists have been using for a long time in terms of its relationship to identity. And this space of unknowing. This space that acknowledges that this language that we're speaking and sharing together, right, is verbal and limited. And that's okay, right? But I think it's important to acknowledge that this verbal language is something that we're all born into, and the verbal language is deeply intrinsic to a certain ideology. Right?
So I was just wondering about how you see the relationship between your performance, because it wasn't an actual performance in addition to being a 16mm film, right?
Right. Yes.
And I'm seeing that as the potential for this space that you're cultivating to be impacted by or kind of embedded within an environment or in a space that's not necessarily yours. Your shadow is on this wall that's not part of the studio wall or not the wall that's within the image. And so I guess I'm thinking about this question that we kind of talked about a little bit before about like, what can the photograph do, or is it, you know, do you ever feel like it's not doing enough, or is it kind of, like, I'm just seeing like that, there's an opening, I think, in that performance, and I guess I'm wondering about like how you view that in relation to the works that are kind of more of like this enclosed space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, thank you for that, Cindy. For me, I think I will be always expanding it. Maybe it's not past the image though for me. It's with the photograph, and photography is absolutely the core of almost every move. You know, the performances, the sculptures, the inherent nature of photography, its ability to endlessly reproduce, right? Or this intense compression of the body, right? Yeah, it's wild. It's truly this drive. Photography is almost this, in the through line. And I do ask that sometimes though, like, will I ever, let go of photography? Or move into other mediums? And maybe, right? But it's truly about seeing, but and now I'm not being articulate at all. It's in every way. It's about photography. The construction of identity, or the shared conceptual map of representation, which we can't undo. How we're inherently hardwired, right, to make discerning between edges. Like we detect edges and saying this is this and this is not this, right? So we, as human beings, need that as a survival strategy, right? That's friend or foe, or that's mother, right? But it's also overlapped with learned conceptual maps, right? And that's really the terrain that we're in right now, is this navigating battle, this battle with representation. The live performance of the film was really different because I'm not trained in theater, but I knew I had to channel the audience through my back. I knew that they would be frontal with my shadow, and so I changed the choreography to be to spend more time with the face and the nape of the neck and the shoulders, like the primary space of identification. And there's a moment that's different at the end because the film more or less goes in a loop, and I'm always in contact for the most part with the wall. But in the performance, at the end I let go. And so for a flickering moment, my body separates from the shadow. I think my feet are still connected. But for just a moment, there's this visual illusion of separating from the language of representation. Because the shadow is the representation it's the copy, right? It's the photo. Thank you.
Thank you.